Hello, and welcome to the fifth in this series of programs about foundational concepts in economics. What we're going to look at in this program is one of the most important, but also in many ways most difficult concepts in economics. This is that of marginal choice, or decision at the margin. One of the basic principles of economics is that most decisions about trade-offs, or how to respond to incentives, are made at the margin. But what does that actually mean? Well, thinking about marginal decision making is a way of answering the question of why, when you exchange goods, when you swap, say, shoes for bread, goods have different values. Why is it that in different times and places and for different people, different goods have different values? Now, economists did not always have the idea of marginal decision-making, of marginal choice. It actually was introduced into economics during what economists call the marginal revolution, which took place at the end of the 19th century. This was an enormous breakthrough in economics and made the whole discipline much more powerful, much better able to explain what was going on in the world than it had been before. The idea of marginal choice was introduced to economics by a number of economists, but four in particular were important: William Stanley Jevons, Leon Walras, Alfred Marshall, and Carl Menger. They were the four economists who all roughly at the same time worked out how marginal decision making worked. Now, the introduction of the idea of marginal choice, marginal decision-making, meant that economists, after the marginal revolution, had a much better idea of value and where it came from. Previously, they didn't really have a good or adequate theory of what value was, why goods had certain values, and why those values varied. Some goods were supposed to have a natural value, or maybe just an exchange value. Others were supposed to have a value which reflected the amount of work it had taken to produce them, the so-called labor theory of value, which you find in the works of economists like Adam Smith, Karl Marx, or indeed pretty much any economist writing before the 1870s. Now, the problem with the labor theory of value, or the alternative theory of natural value, is that it has trouble with what was known as the paradox of value, or as it was often called, the diamond water paradox. The paradox is this: diamonds, if you think about it, are not very useful. They can't feed you, they don't do much for you, they're basically only of use for either engraving things or as an ornament. Water, on the other hand, is vital for human existence. You can't live without water. But if you find a diamond lying in the road, it's incredibly valuable, even though it has taken no effort for you to find it. Whereas on the other hand, water, which if you can't find, you will die, is basically very, very cheap. So why is it that diamonds are valuable and water is not? And this is the big conundrum or paradox that the economists could not solve. So how does marginal choice work? Well, it is based upon a number of principles. The first of these, which Carl Menger in particular emphasized, is that value is ultimately subjective. There is no objective or universal value. Value is like beauty in the eye or taste of the choosing consumer, the beholder, if you will. Value is created by the act of choosing between courses of action, because it's the choice you make that tells you which course of action or which good you go for you value more than another. And this is a purely subjective phenomenon. Somebody might regard getting a ticket to go to a Ed Sheeran concert as being incredibly valuable. somebody else might regard it as being much less valuable than, for example, a ticket to go to watch a football match. That's a purely subjective choice. Now, what that means is that you can rank the different uses of a good that people will have under conditions of scarcity. You can say that, given scarce resources, consumers will rank the different uses to which you can put a certain good. And this, however, takes place within the limits that are imposed by the existence of scarcity. Now, the second part of this is that given this ranking, if additional resources become available, they'll be applied to the use that you value most highly, that you give the highest priority to. So if you have, to take the quintessential case, more money suddenly coming into hands, you will tend to spend that money on the use that you give the highest priority to, but which you previously had not been able to meet. Conversely, if the amount of resources you have declines, you will stop applying them to the least valuable use that you can put them to, and you will pull back from that. Now, this was summed up in a very famous example by the well-known Austrian economist and sometime finance minister of Austria, Eugen von Bohm-Bawerk. Bohm-Bawerk said, suppose you have a farmer, and the farmer has 5 sacks of grain. This is what he has produced. He takes 1 sack of grain and uses it to feed himself and his family. The second sack of grain is used to feed his livestock, his animals. The third sack he puts aside to plant the following year. He uses the 4th sack to make beer for himself. And he uses the final sack to feed his pet parrots, which is just purely for entertainment. Now, suppose that there's a reduction in the amount of grain he has. He only has 4 sacks of grain rather than 5. What will he do? At this point, he has to make a choice. And what he will choose to do is to keep the sack for feeding his family, keep the sack for feeding the animals, keep obviously the sack for next year's planting and the one for beer, but he will let his parrots starve because that's the least valuable use of the finite resource of grain. The point is that he doesn't make this decision with regard to the sack, the amount of grain he has as a whole. He does not reduce the amount he uses for each of those 5 uses by an equivalent amount. He makes the decision at the margin as to how to allocate the final amount that he's got, the one that in this case he's no longer has. And that's what's meant by saying that you make decisions at the margin. Decisions are made not with regard to the value to you of an entire class or type of good. They're made by virtue of the value to you of an additional unit, more or less, of that class of assets or goods. That's what you that is the point at which you decide how to allocate it, whether or not to use it, how to make the trade-off. You don't make it at the start when you know how the whole amount is. You make it according to how you allocate the additional unit, more or less. And that's what is meant by saying that decision is made at the margin. Now, what this means is that therefore the value of something and the rate at which it exchanges for something else is determined therefore by the value of an additional unit, its marginal value, not the value of the class of goods as a whole. Now that is why diamonds are more valuable and command a higher price than water. If you have no diamonds, or if you have, let's say, 1 diamond, the value of an additional diamond is very high. If you have a jug of water, unless you're in the extreme conditions of being in a desert, the value of an additional jug of water is much less than the value of an additional diamond. And therefore, because you make decisions about how to exchange and trade goods and which one to have, at the margin, in terms of the value of an additional unit of the good, water is cheap and diamonds are valuable. Now, the final element of the theory, which we need to think about, is the principle of diminishing marginal utility. This is that the value of each additional increment of a good will tend to decline. Think, for example, of a pint of beer in very hot weather, and assume that you like beer. Suppose it's a very hot day and you have a pint of cold beer. You will value that very highly. The second pint of beer, the additional pint of beer, the marginal pint of beer, you will value slightly less, because although you will get benefit from it, the benefit will be less than what you got from the first one. A third pint of beer will bring you still less benefit. And eventually, by the time you get to a certain point, and I'm not going to say precisely where, the value will actually be negative. It will make you feel seriously ill. Now, you can say this for almost any good. Each additional unit of the good will bring you benefit, but the benefit that you get will be less and less with each additional one. And so the additional unit that determines the price that you will, on average, be prepared to pay for the good in exchange will be the value you get from the last unit that you would be prepared to actually pay something for. And that's the price that the good will command in a situation of free exchange. This is a difficult concept, but it's very, very powerful, because it explains why that things have the value that they do, which is often very counterintuitive, and it enables you to think about exchange and the way in which prices come into being using simple but very elegant mathematical models. So the principle that choice is made not in terms of classes as a whole, but at the margin in terms of the value of an additional unit, more or less, that is one of the foundational principles of modern economics.